Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Deep Thoughts on this air show day in Huntington Beach, California. So you're going to hear a few F-18s go by and perhaps even an F-16, but they're almost done. Today I thought I would talk about something that is, I've mentioned elements of it, but we haven't just gone straight for it. You've already seen the title, so you know. How they faked the moon mission. One of the things I hear a lot is, and it's actually starting to boil off, it's more of a baby boomer, and God bless you if you're a baby boomer and you watch this show, you're not the people I'm talking about, but your average baby boomer that just has a limited brain. They just, in this particular area, they're such good people, is what it is that they just have a limited amount of evil that they can conceive of. And so the problem is, oh, I can't imagine this, I can't imagine that. And one of the things they always say is, well, I can't believe the moon hoax is a conspiracy because, or the moon hoax is real because I can't imagine all those people conspiring against America. And then no one said anything, right? That's always the super chicken shit technique of not dealing with the information. And it doesn't matter, it's so funny because I have relatives who say this and they almost laugh through it in a condescending way that's like, oh Mark, there's nothing that you can say that will get past my super deep intellectual cowardice, never research anything, know everything fucking brain. Well, today is an episode to give you some ammunition against that ridiculous cowardice way of allowing evil to perpetuate over and over and over, right? Let's not forget, I say it all the time, NASA pulls down, this was a figure from 2014 when I had the other show, MK Ultra Radio, $60 million a day in absolute fraudulent science, just selling us pictures while they take the money and do whatever the hell they're doing with it. Who knows? But here's the rub, and this is where we get back to the accusation of, well, I just can't imagine that many people conspiring against the world. Now, I'm going to be a little facetious here because I don't know the exact digits, but I would wager that you could probably take, out of everyone who worked on the Apollo missions, from the second that JFK announced it to the second we pulled off of supposedly the last Apollo mission, you could interview 98 to 99% of everyone involved in all the construction and all the testing with a polygraph, one that's absolutely perfect, again, given to us by God. This one's absolutely 100%. And you ask these people, did you participate in man stepping on the moon where this was real? And they're going to say yes. And they're going to pass the polygraph test. But it doesn't mean that it actually took place. And some of you are going to go, yeah, of course. And some of you are going to go, what? What do you mean? They passed the polygraph test, but it wasn't real. How does that work? Because in their brains, they were so utterly compartmentalized, they believe that whatever they did actually ended up on the moon. There's a guy in Costa Mesa. His father supposedly, his father did, work on special kind of bolts that were used on the Apollo capsule and the module and all this other stuff. And in his heart of hearts, his father's a hero because his father participated in the Apollo missions. He thinks his dad's stuff went to the moon. Now, I'm not the kind of asshole to tell him otherwise, but I've had to hear this, and I've seen his chest puffed up. Now, that guy, as far as I understand, the son, didn't do anything much with his life. He just inherited all of his dad's stuff, and so he's kind of like, I don't need to ever become anything because my dad's something. My dad was something. I've got these genes, and it's like, okay, if you don't take care of him, brother, it's as if he never existed. But if you think about the command center at Houston, these people are staring at monitors, reading numbers coming in from some feed somewhere in the universe. And they believe that they are seeing a mission taking place, not realizing that earlier the year of 1969, that a demo satellite, a satellite was pushed into low orbit and was beaming down telemetry for the entire mission from start to finish as a simulation of the mission. The physical difference between the simulation of the mission and the one that actually was televised on television, in terms of the numbers they saw, was just the numbers adjusted a little bit. So someone staring at a monitor with a lie detector test will say, well, yeah, I was told that what I was staring at was real data. Of course I think we went to the moon. Bing, the light turns green. Next person. But I know what some of you think. Some of you think, well, there was three antenna receiver stations strategically placed around the world such that no matter where the world turned, we were always able to talk to the astronauts on the moon, hear their communications, then relay it with ground technology. They interviewed these old guys. We're going to get into the start to finish thing here. But they interviewed these old guys, I believe in Australia, a British documentary person. I believe it was Australia, but nevertheless, I saw it, and they're really old guys now. And he let them tell their story about how every time they, went over or they were pointed at the moon, they got the data, and when they were in low orbit, they got all the orbital data. And the guy finally just asked him. He said, "Well, couldn't it have been that this was broadcast from that demo satellite that was up there?" And they all looked at each other really funny, as if it was for the very first time they had never contemplated that that was a possibility. And one of them had the courage, if not two, to go, "Oh my God, he's right. We could have been had." Now, the other thing that is really silly that people forget is that you can broadcast from the ground or from a plane directly at a receiver, and it will feel like it's from space. You just adjust the frequency, the wattage, and you will feel like you're getting it, exactly from where it's supposed to be. If it's supposed to be from the moon, you broadcast it really weak at the antenna. But you could be literally on the same antenna. You could just have a little receiver. There's been all kinds of signal interruptions in this world for pranks, right? But let's rewind. Obviously, what I'm going to tell you is partially what I have deduced from Bart Sibrel's series, partially from a tremendous number of YouTube videos created by special effects gurus. My own friends who are special effects gurus have taken the photography and put it through software to say, whoa, there's 5 light sources in this image. It's also going to rely on the 2 people that debriefed me in 1991, who were both on the Mars mission, and then my own hunches. Now, YouTube is just strictly by itself. With the videos made by gurus, there's a bit of a rub here, because usually we're able to say this is the source of this and the source of that. In 2005, the amount of videos that were being put online that had been made in the 90s and the 80s picking apart the moon missions were unbelievable. And they were so incredibly revealing that one video, which I can't find anymore, which dealt with front projection, I simply can't find it anymore. There's a video of Buzz Aldrin saying in a late night interview with some news station, once we find out how to get to the moon, it'll be a lot easier to get to Mars. The Jeranism guys got that clip inside one of his videos, but the dude won't respond to anything on YouTube, so I don't know how to get a hold of the guy. If you guys want to go out and pound him for that clip, he may know exactly what clip he has in it. Once we get that clip, we're gonna scrape it out of his video and put it all over the planet so you guys can see it, because it's one of my opening lines in my episode 26, and people are like, what the hell are you talking about? Some of you have seen it, very few of you have seen it, some of you haven't seen it, but it's real. I mean, there's some things in this world you just can't make up, and that would be one that would be pointless to make up, right? Now, the Moon Hoax requires a tremendous amount of perspective. The overall goal, which, again, we're not sure exactly if this was meant to be or this was just a general byproduct, but what we got out of the moon missions was the ICBM, the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile. The second we were done with the missions in 73, we saw the Trident submarine, with that missile pops out of the water, blows off its shield, and hauls ass across the ocean. So we have, it had been militarized incredibly. And if you look at all of the scientists coming out of Germany, who'd made, Werner von Braun made the V1 and V2 rocket, it was all weaponized stuff. Now, I was going to do a little digression here. There's some of you that are rediscovering the history of World War II. We'll just leave it like that. Who were the bad guys? Who were the good guys? And when traditional phrases come out that really make a particular group look evil and bad and another group look good, there is a distinct possibility that we have all those backwards. And so whether or not these Nazis were horrible or not, in various arenas based on who was pushing whose buttons and who was trying to be peaceful and who was trying to be at war, I know some of you are aware of that, those debates that are going on now. I don't know if anyone's been completely conclusive because, again, as the internet continues to exist, a bunch of new stuff gets revealed that it's like 40, 50 years old. But anyway, NASA is built out of the rocketeering masterminds out of Germany led by Werner von Braun. Now this guy almost undoubtedly wanted to travel into space. Why not? What's the point of a rocket if you can't travel to space? Now whether or not you can actually accomplish it is a completely different thing. Now I learned from Sabrell that Werner von Braun's major plan was to build a space station and ferry fuel up to a space station in low orbit around Earth and build a vehicle that could then continue the journey to wherever you wanted it to go. As I've heard it presented to me, Werner von Braun's original target was Mars. And supposedly in the White House said, let's try the moon, dude. It seems sort of mind-blowing to me that a person of Werner von Braun's excellence would pick a ridiculously far-away target as his first thing. But I also think that in his brain he was going to build a rocket that had so much fuel on it that he's going to almost manually drive it there. And I don't know, again, how you account for a lot of the variance in velocity of our planet's orbital speed, Mars's orbital speed, and how you're going to catch up, jump into a car with the door open at 100 miles an hour. I just don't know how that's possible. But that's for a different episode. So the other thing to remember, and again, we've done this in the second episode, so we got, Khrushchev is like really rubbing it in hardcore. Sputnik, first astronaut in space. Again, these things could be fake. These could be claymation things. There's a lot of evidence to that, but they are definitely throwing beeping objects into orbit around the Earth. Even if it only goes one orbit and falls back, they were able to do it. Now, I know some of you are really upset about the theory of space existing and what have you. Let's just say that orbit may not be what is traditionally thought to be if you have a problem with this, okay? Please don't fill up the comments with a bunch of alternate universe theories. This conversation is for those who believe that the Moon Hoax is at least capable of low orbit. Now, what's hard for a lot of young people to understand is that there were no rockets, okay? The V1 and V2 rocket out of Germany that was just hurled into England, for those of you too young to remember, or that didn't get the history, Werner von Braun designed these big fat rockets that were sort of black and white checkers, little Masonic thing, and he would shoot them into southern England indiscriminately, meaning he didn't care whether or not they hit friend or foe, or a military target or a personal target. So most of them just landed in neighborhoods. They were so massive with a conventional warhead, meaning just explosives, not nuclear weapon heads, because that didn't exist for them. They blow a house completely to smithereens, kill the family, all kinds of shrapnel flying everywhere, and it was just to rain terror on them. And again, Churchill wouldn't leave them alone, so that might be the reason why that ended up happening. Then there was a refinement to it with a little bit more guidance, a little bit more range, and they were trying to hit London with these things, right? So the V2 goes deeper into the UK, using timed gyroscopes to tip the thing over. So when it came to putting something in orbit, that's a whole nother bag, man. That is way beyond just hurling something over the pond, over the little river, and smashing it into a house. I would wager it's 10 to 100 times more difficult to put something into orbit. And the theory of orbit, just for those of you who don't know, is that you throw an object so far that when it tries to come down, the Earth is missing because it's over the edge of the Earth, and so it falls around the Earth, and the push from ethereal winds, this is this show's theory, it pushes it back to Earth. But it already has so much forward momentum that it keeps falling around the Earth. It just keeps falling and falling and falling. And eventually the orbit does deteriorate. And if you don't have some rocketry to move it back out, then it will slam into the Earth and eventually be over. So we needed to build a rocket to get into orbit, to get into low orbit. Low orbit is about, I don't exactly know what the cutoff is, but I would say 200 miles up. Now, 5,280 feet is a single mile, so multiply that times 200, and you'll start getting how far up we are. Massive. Like, we have to engage the Russians head on. Now, the thing is that the Russians weren't saying we're making weapons. We're making missiles that can get to you with nuclear warheads or whatever we want to put in these things. He wasn't saying that. It was just this peaceful, beautiful thing. Hey, we're just putting people in space. But of course, military people are going, holy shit, you realize if he can get things into space, then he can get to us at a moment's notice and he can blow us to pieces. And of course, there was the nuclear scare had been, wreaking havoc. The duck and cover movement of the 50s was already insanely intense and creating. There's a few of you who've commented about it. I have some close friends of mine in their 70s, and they said it was horrifying to see bomb tests. Like, one of my friends lived in Salt Lake City, and he said that when he was a kid, he'd run to the window and they were televising the explosion at night, the test, and he could see the plumes over the mountainscapes, the bright lights and stuff, and he would run in his bedroom and hide because the second half of a bomb is the big concussion cloud, right, that's coming at you. So imagine, if you see a car accident, typically in the middle of an intersection, it's like, well, it's over there. But imagine the car accident happens and now this big shock wave comes at you and it could kill you. So as soon as you see a car accident about to occur, you're ducking and covering because this thing is going to come at you. It's a whole different science for the brain that we really don't have to deal with today, because I think most of us realize there's never going to be a nuclear war. If a nuclear bomb ever goes off in the world, it's going to be a deep state, false flag to herd us all under one world government stuff, right? Let's just hope that it's never something that our military does. So the one scientific addition to rocketry that a orbital rocket has to accomplish is, unlike the V1 and V2, which just gets hurled into sort of close space and then slams against some soil in England, this thing's got to keep going, and it's got to go so fast that it's going to escape the Earth's gravitational pull. I mean, that thing goes 11 miles per second. Crazy fast. So now we have to do multi-stage rockets. The complexity of that is enormous. Not only do you have to have a propellant that's willing to go without pure oxygen being available. The V1 and V2 rocket had a solid state engine, as I understand it. So it was a propulsion system that was almost like the little rockets that you can do as a kid. The A, B, C, D engines that are hard, right? And you light them with the fuse and they burn. I'm not sure if the V1 or V2, either one of those got to fuel rockets, but when you run out of air, your propulsion system is going to have oxygen mixed inside of the fuel system. And so they had to come up with a new propellant. Now they have to have a multi-stage rocket, and if you think about it, imagine you had two of the little cardboard tubes that are inside your toilet paper. Well, one of them, let's say, and you had the cardboard one that's twice as tall or 3 times as tall. So you take the cardboard one and you kind of try to bend it with your hand, maybe a Pringles can or something, and it's like, hey, that's pretty easy, right? You can make a long tube. It's really simple. But the second that you have to stack these things up, one with a really large boost to get out of the thicker part of the atmosphere, and then one to get to the second thinner part of the atmosphere, and then you have to connect them together, and they have to hang on to each other under the most enormous pressures you could possibly imagine, right? You're going to take this thing, stack it up on each other, and then move at 11 miles per second. Unbelievable stress on metal. So the integrity of how to build this thing was really daunting in the 60s. It had really never been done before. Okay. So they have to, in order to begin anything that's going to hoax the minds of anyone, and again, I personally want to believe that they attempted to do this, for real and just simply found out that they weren't able to do it, and so they did the next best thing, which was to hoax it out, right? So to get this thing to take off is one of the most phenomenal accomplishments of mankind to begin with. Just low orbit is phenomenal. And so now it's pretty turnkey, right? The SpaceX company was able just to start standing on the shoulders of giants. And it's like, oh, wow, the Falcon series just launches and it's just totally easy. Now, of course, they have this claim that these boosters come back and land, and we know that a tremendous amount of computer-generated imagery has been used to fake a giant swath of SpaceX's technical claims. And you talk about FEC or SEC violations. Don't worry about him, tweeting about, being a private company. To lie to your shareholders with computer-generated imagery is probably a brand new game that makes other companies jealous, right? So the first goal is to get a rocket to do anything at all. Now, in terms of what the milestones were in the 60s, the number one thing that they needed to do, although they could probably have figured out a way to fake it, is to get something, just get this triangular, conical capsule into low orbit. That's all they need to do to complete the entire moon hoax. And some of you might be saying, well, what do you mean? There's a whole moon surface thing and the re-entry and the landing on the moon and coming back up to the... Those things could be simulated in a studio, which is the video that I can't find anymore. It was all regarding front projection. The guy actually showed some of the footage that was sold to the public as real footage of the moon landing, and then he ran a projector against a front projection shape in his studio. I said, there's the same exact shot. Amazing, right? And you'd think about this, and it was thinking about the footage in a completely opposite way. For instance, let me go back to the toilet paper roll. Let's say you had a really high-res 4K camera, and you put it inside the opening of a toilet paper roll. So we're going to have that James Bond looking out the barrel thing, right? The old shot where the gun goes back and forth, and then Bond shoots, and then the blood comes down the gun barrel, signifying that he got the guy that was pointing the gun at him, right? Well, your brain is thinking the black outer area is the part of the tube that the camera is inside of that is blocking the shot from being outside. And you see the shot kind of move around, right? Well, front projection allows you to make a circular canvas. You project against it in a black room. Any light that is not hitting the canvas is completely lost in this dark room. And then all you have to do is take your source video, wherever you have it, and just shake it in the room. And when you see it on the circle, it looks like you're looking out of a tube, but you're not. They just reversed it in your brain. The big shot of the lunar module top part, where it's supposed to have the two astronauts in it, they came back up to the orbital Apollo module as it docks back with the system. This is the shot that he actually showed us in this video. This old guy. And he was pretty much nonchalant, like, yeah, man, I helped develop this. Interesting. Now, the other part of the at-home, above-ground testing was the spacesuit, was the capsule, was all the stress testing of all these objects, showing them falling in the water. The astronauts actually roaming around inside the water, which was simulating sort of a 0G or a light 1/6 gravity. And also, water is an amazing test medium to figure out whether or not something is airproof. If you ever talk to a plumber, they will tell you that water can go where air can't. And when I learned that as a kid, I was like, whoa, that's pretty wild. And so you can actually have a leak in a suit, and as soon as it's got extra moisture inside, they know they got a problem, and so they continue working on it. Now, the other thing was that NASA was a brand new organization, and so the problem is they had limited staff. It was a brand new organization. And so they had to reach out to all kinds of different agencies around the planet to get compartmentalized to get certain parts made. You make the suit, you make the capsule, you make the engines, you make the fuselage, or whatever you call the main cabinet, or the main cylinder area, right? Someone's got to build the big crawler, that big giant crawler that took the Saturn V and drove 1 mile an hour up to the launch pad. Someone's going to build the launch pad. This stuff gets enormous, and it created a tremendous amount of jobs. And because everything was so difficult at every step of the way, we gained a tremendous amount of knowledge about all these different areas. So there's a lot of benefit to this program going on. The catch is that getting to the moon is a major, unbelievably dangerous situation. And our knowledge of space and the Van Allen belts, the natural magnetic barrier that goes around the Earth, was virtually unknown, or at least untested, right? We had theories that these things existed. We know that the compass moves itself north every single time we pull it out. And so we're thinking something is causing this to happen on the surface of the Earth. And so when the space shuttle went up in 1998, and I think hit 450, 475, the astronauts got super duper sick, as it was, I think, written in the 1998 CNN article. It basically said the Van Allen belts are more lethal than NASA previously thought. The astronauts were seeing shooting stars with their eyes closed because the electrons are going through and putting pressure on their cones and their rods in their eyeball. People got nauseous because it's minor radiation exposure. And they had to drop the space shuttle 100 plus miles down to normal orbiting 350-ish, and then they came home because everybody was unwell. And I didn't hear anyone, dropping dead as a result of that mission, so hopefully everyone's fine. But that shows you just how lethal it is up there. And the Van Allen belts are said to not exist until about 1,000 miles up. Now, if we have geocentric satellites, then we've got satellites deep past the Van Allen belts. And so as we launch these satellites, if they truly exist up there, then they are punching through that and they can take measurements. What's strange is, for some reason, the Orion project was greenlit 2 years ago and hastily canceled after one mission, or at least put in a black op scenario because the data was coming in and it was refuting the ability to put a human being through the Van Allen belts. So you have a very small group of people sit in a room and say this: all right, how are we going to pull this off? Now, I want to stress that the brilliance of these individuals, who will probably never be known, is high. It is clever times clever to the power of clever, what they were actually able to pull off. So there's an amazing accomplishment by people who were probably just trying to save the reputation of the United States of America and potentially, obviously, pioneer some technology along the way. So you have a breaking point at some point where they realize that they can't pull this off. And I would imagine that this would have been fairly early in the process. Kennedy announces this thing, and then we go for it. Within a couple years, I think, they really did the math and said, are you crazy? Do you have any idea how far away the moon is? Do you have any idea how volatile space is, how volatile the moon surface is? In fact, we don't even really know what the moon surface is made out of. Is it soft? Is it hard? If we put a 10,000-pound thrust rocket down, use it to land safely, is it going to blow a huge crater in the ground? Or is it going to be fine? We don't know. So the contingency plan starts at some phantom point in time. As I suggested in my episode 26, I think the green lighting of, basically the approach of Arthur C. Clarke, a NASA scientist and writer, he was getting into writing. He approached Stanley Kubrick for a television show. Stanley said, I don't do television shows, I do movies. And he says, okay, well, I will start working on a movie version of this idea that I have for a television series. And they went and got, I think, about $15 million to make the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey, which at the time there was only a couple movies in history that actually had a higher budget than that. So someone was like, don't worry, we'll get you the money. But there's a very specific distinction for 2001: A Space Odyssey. The goal is to create the most realistic space movie ever. And I mean ever. I'm not sure, since 1968, when it debuted, have we ever really tried to create a completely realistic space movie? Because you can't throw gravity at me, because I mean there's just kitschy little things with stuff, a bunch of bent science, sound in space, all this other stuff. But the props that were created to finish this film were very helpful for the eventual props that are created for the soundstage that ends up being where all the moon footage takes place. There's just one catch. One real intense catch for this Moon Hoax thing. Because a bunch of agents working for these alphabet agencies, they're totally into it, man. They're like, man, we get to fake the moon mission? That is awesome. That's going to be a lot of fun. There's at least one director who I believe has confessed to having done it, Stanley Kubrick, for at least mission 11 and 13. But the problem is you're going to have to come up with some astronauts, a group of 3, to go along with the hoax. Which means you're going to have to find unbelievably talented pre-existing astronauts based off of the Air Force, Top Guns, and you're going to have to get them to lie, to go against the oath of their entire objective of being in the military, and then hang on to the lie for the rest of their lives. Unfortunately for Gus Grissom and his 2 compadres, and unfortunately for NASA, he was the number 1 candidate to go first. But Gus Grissom, and I don't know about the opinions of his comrades, but Gus wasn't a liar. He wasn't going to do it. He called the project a lemon. He said, we are never going to the moon with this technology. I don't know if he said it in any method of anger, or if he just incidentally said, well, they're telling you this is going to happen, but this isn't going to happen with this technology. According to my interview with Bart Sabrell, who has spoken with the family, both the mother and the son, who is a pilot today, he was murdered. The 3 of them were murdered probably by cyanide capsules, or cyanide being injected into their environmental suits when they were sitting on the Apollo 1 and I believe it was just the test the day before. And then they set the cabin on fire because they want to blame the pure oxygen environment. These men were bolted into 5-point seatbelts, and none of them attempted to undo their seatbelts and pull the dynamite emergency door to hopefully get the fire out the door. They just sat there. The pictures of them are on the internet where they just sat there. They didn't move. Their hands didn't move. There was no chaotic pictures of, like you and I, if any of us were set on fire, you do what Richard Pryor does and you run down the street, You try to put yourself out. Probably wouldn't run down the street, but you wouldn't be in this rested position, burned to death. So they had to kill Gus Grissom and his 2 partners because he wouldn't go along with it. Maybe his partners were the same, I don't know. And that's probably a little bit of a setback because they then have to go to the other astronauts because they can't be killing them all. And they have to find folks that are probably 33-degree Masons who feel some upper rationale. They probably had to change their story to the astronauts and say, okay, here's the deal. Russia, they're a super pain in our ass. What we're really trying to do is bankrupt them, develop ICBMs so that once we bankrupt them, we can hold them captive with the threat of nuclear rain. Are you willing to protect your country? I know it's a weird thing that we have to do, but we can't go out to the American people and say we're going to spend $10 billion in 1960 money, 1970 money, to build a bunch of weapons that everyone's terrified of. Because people are, again, they terrified everyone with nuclear weapons, and then they can't say we're going to put them in the sky and be able to send them wherever we want to send them. At least that was probably their opinion, right? So what's the plan? How do we fake this thing? Well, we have to put 3 guys into low orbit because we need to fake images of the Earth from space. We need to have weightlessness And we're going to have a big splashdown when it's over. Now, while you're in low orbit, faking that you're going further and further away from the Earth using this circular window inside your cabin, we're going to have a bunch of agents in a soundstage who have been rehearsing for probably months, if not years, this whole scenario. When you look at the script from NASA to the astronauts as to how this whole thing is going to be going down, you have a 2-column script, which I'd never seen before. One is for the astronauts and one is for the ground control. They say this, you say that. We're doing this, then you do this. And so it looked like the whole thing was scripted out like a Hollywood script. We know that NASA tapped Hollywood to light the Saturn V so it looked absolutely sexy in the dark when they launched this thing into space. Okay? So the soundstage, let's talk about that for a split second. They have to fake the surface of the moon. How would you do that? Well, we do have pretty powerful telescopes. We can look at the moon's surface and kind of get a general idea of, what it would be like to be on the ground. They have super high-res photographs that they can use to construct pictures and models of the moon's surface. Now, NASA built at least 2 gigantic mock moons within a warehouse. You can go see pictures of these, and they show them to you, and they say this is just what we use to simulate a test of going to the moon. The joke is that it's hidden in plain sight. It's right in your face. The very prop they use to fake the footage of the lunar module going down to the surface as the surface went like this was a big model that didn't have a bottom or a top, and it had a camera on a train track. And I'll put these photos in the video for those of you coming through podcast. But they simply bring the camera closer and closer to the surface using robot-controlled arms to keep it very steady. This is where all this technology came from that made Star Wars possible. In fact, one of the great Oscar award-winning guys, Richard Edlund, worked on spy cameras before he became a part of the Star Wars franchise way back in the 70s and 73, 74. One of the other models is a true top-to-bottom, slightly smaller but very large, I think it's probably 15 to 20 feet in diameter, surface of the moon. And there are pictures of these guys sculpting the surface with, some clay, some putty, whatever it is, recreating what they see in photographs on these models. So when you think you're seeing footage of the moon's surface, you're merely looking at a camera filming a model. As they say in Quest for the Holy Grail, it's only a model. But the soundstage. The soundstage has a lot of versatility, but it has a lot of drawbacks as well. First drawback is, the moon's got 1/6 gravity, so how the hell are we going to fake these astronauts not being on 1/1 gravity? I'm not sure who came up with the idea, but again, this is utterly brilliant. They overcranked the camera 2x. And all that means is, one, you have to have a pretty good storage facility for film, because you're going to be blowing through this thing, blowing through this stuff at twice the speed. But if you were to say 24 frames per second is the average movie in 1968, when 2001: A Space Odyssey was came out in the theaters, and then you shoot it at 48 frames per second, so twice the amount of frames are going through the camera, but then when you play it back, you play it at 24. Everything is slow, but the resolution is good. It doesn't look like one of those 1905 videos where everyone's moving really fast, bursting in their velocities. Nah, it's perfect. The resolution is there, and it's great camera work, right? Well, the other problem you have with the soundstage is that there is no way in 1969 that they could fake the star pattern in the sky. They can't address the Milky Way, which would be utterly immutable, meaning you couldn't blotch it out, even if they gave you that excuse about the iris of the camera, the aperture of the camera being so tight that it can't let in the light to let starlight in. Now, there's some situations where that would be the case, but the Milky Way was there, completely unscathed by an atmosphere, right? The moon doesn't have an atmosphere according to NASA. Now, maybe it does, and maybe it doesn't. Who knows? But when you go outside in a big city and you look up, all the lights that are in the city are reflecting off of the atmosphere, reflecting off the fog, the clouds, and so you have this big glow. That's why when you drive towards Vegas in the desert, you can see it an hour before you get there. Well, there's none of that in space. Zero. So the Milky Way that you see in Lake Havasu in the middle of the night, which is utterly gorgeous, is probably 2 to 3 times the lumens that you would see on Earth when you're on the moon. But they can't do it. And why can't they do it? Well, the inside of a studio is a square box, a rectangular box. And so you can't have distortion of a bunch of star maps, someone putting a bunch of LEDs or lights or poking holes in a surface, and then have it turn a corner, and then have the ceiling attached to it. Big problem. As well, you can't run a rigging situation where all of the astronauts, and I've tested this with my own eyes, taking high-res footage from NASA of the astronauts jumping across the moon surface, and I was able to establish that directly and perpendicular to the ground, there is a wire that's disturbing the pixels in a perfect vertical line. In fact, one point I found a frame, I'll try to put it in the video, where when I high-conned it, when I turned up all the contrast, you can distinctly see a perpendicular line directly to the astronaut. Now, all the astronaut suits have a 6-inch antenna, I believe on their left shoulder. So people say, no, you're seeing the antenna. The problem is the antenna is parallel with the back of the astronaut. So if they're leaning forward at all, it's not going to be a perfect straight up line. They'd have to stand utterly straight up. And very few shots of the astronauts have that. So how do you solve for that problem? You simply tell the people of the world that they can't see stars in the cameras because they are adjusted for the super bright surface. Again, I think there's a lot of truth to that, up to the point of seeing the Milky Way. But some of you need to look up the lumens of the star Sirius. Extremely bright. That little star out there, and again, uninhibited by any atmosphere at all. When you're at Lake Havasu, you're still staring through miles and miles of atmosphere. So on the moon, who knows how bright that thing would be? I think it'd be bright as hell. Okay? You don't see any of that stuff. The astronauts were told when they came back for the super depressed debriefing to the press, Michael Collins said, I don't think I remember seeing any stars. That's a ridiculous assertion, because even with his human eyes, he should be able to see it. When he's going from Earth to the moon, all 3 of them should have been able to see it. But they're saying they didn't see it, because that's what they're told. It covers up for the fact that this soundstage cannot recreate the star map, right? Now, Bart said in my interview with him that the old books of the 70s that had the fake imagery from NASA for these missions had 2 distinct colors of black. That they had the matted fake in post-production matting of any of the I-beams and things that may have gotten into the shot. They basically covered up inside the negative. And then it has, at some point, has to turn into the actual photograph of the actual astronaut sitting on the soundstage. Now, what other problems do you have with the soundstage? Well, the surface of the moon is going to be something that's going to be very delicate. Someone has to make these things. Now, there's 2 different stories about this. One I have I'm bringing to you personally, not from some other source. The other one is that when I looked at how NASA was preparing for the launch, they actually figured out that putting bombs in soil and blowing them up creates perfect-looking craters. And again, I think if you look at my episode, Do Craters Exist?, you'll figure out that none of these are craters. These are volcanic eruptions, could be caused by electrical spouts from the center of the plasma core of the moon, or it could be just tension, just like we have volcanoes here. But they're definitely an explosion from the inside of the moon and not something that's hit the moon. So those millions and millions of perfectly circular craters that you're seeing are not from particles from space hitting the moon's surface. But the other one is that I bumped into a guy that said that when he saw the moon missions, he said he knew that they were fake. And this is funny because I met him at a house where the individual who owned the home thinks that they're real. And I said, well, tell me why you think this was fake. And he said, I built a machine in college that I installed into my university. And I forgot what the university was, but this guy's a famous car painter. And he said, all I did was, it was a catapult system. I put the finest of sand in this room, and my catapult just threw varying size rocks in a particular trajectory such that they would always perfectly land straight down. Again, this is what doesn't happen on the moon. This doesn't happen in reality. So he built the machine to do this very specific thing. It weighed the rock and then said, okay, I got to pitch you in a certain way. Boom. He said when he saw the moon's surface in these studio shots, he goes, that was my machine. And coincidentally, NASA bought his machine in 1964. Nobody knows that little factoid, do they? Now, whether or not they used his machine or not, we'll never know. But they bought it. And he said it was a perfect match between what he had and what he saw in the photographs. But let's just say they use bombs, they use this catapult system to create this beautiful surface. It must remain pristine from all the cast and crew during the entire process. You can't have Nike shoes here and loafers there, or human foot there. You can't. Any of that would reveal the evidence that this is fake. Now, some of you are also hip to the fact that some of the rocks look like they're made of paper mache. Well, for those of you who are recently born, paper mache was a massive form of entertainment and crafts at high schools and middle schools and grade schools all the way through the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. Okay, so building these things out of crumpled up newspapers that have been soaked, and basically you reduce a newspaper to pulp, and then you can do anything you want with it. You can build an object out of cardboard and then stuff the stuff on the outside, and it'll look like a rock, especially in black and white. But all of the objects that are supposed to be on the moon's surface are going to have to be lowered from a crane down to the surface. The astronauts have to be also carried by cable across this surface and put on the ladder without having stepped on the moon. There can't be any tracks on the moon until they do it themselves. Well, the one thing that they screwed up, and it probably would have been extremely hard with the set that they put together. Maybe this was intentional, and they thought no one would ever care, they could get through this. But something that we now know as a complete sign of proof is that when the Apollo 11 lunar module came down to the moon's surface, you've all seen the footage of all the dirt scattering underneath. You know, when they looked out the window, they shot that all this soil from the moon's surface flying away. But when we have pictures of the outside of the lunar module, one, there's this little, I don't know what it is. It must have been a sheath for the motor cone that comes out of the bottom. None of the soil has been moved underneath this thing, and the legs, which I believe are only 4, I think I said 5 the other day, had no soil on them. And so they're moving metric tons of soil with this 10,000-pound thrust rocket, supposedly, but no stuff is on the legs. It's proof that this stuff was lowered down by a crane. Okay. But now you have to have astronauts inside of these suits that are air pressured, and they're real suits. They really probably have 100% possibility of not the radiation that they're going to get out on the moon's surface, which would kill them, but they would most likely be able to be pretty airtight in these things. But the problem is that it probably would weigh so much, especially if you put the environmental pack on, that you would need 1/6 gravity to be able to move freely inside of them. Any of you who have been in a scuba tank, you put 2 scuba tanks on, you're going to do a really long dive, and you try to walk around the ship deck, especially with a big parka suit on that's, super insulated, inflated, that moving around, if you're a scuba diver in this spacesuits in 1/1 gravity, would be very, very tough. Every time they trained in water, they were on all kinds of harnesses and cables because they just simply weighed too much. And so they have to do something about the environmental systems. Well, they just take them out. They're empty. Well, that means you're inside a very hot outfit. And there was this pathetic attempt to dismiss the myths, and Bart Sibrel put a great video out on his channel that proves that the shadows were converging on the moon, which means they had multiple light sources. Again, Hollywood people have put it through software and said there's at least 5 sources and 5 light sources in most of the shots from Apollo 11 at least. But these guys are really hot and sweaty, and on this set where they went out to the desert to simulate this, the astronauts, the actors inside these astronaut suits are already sweating profusely. Their faces are covered in sweat when they pull down the little shield, which we're going to get to in a second, that covers their face. So the whole soundstage has to be cooled down, and I mean cooled down. Those of you who have seen the making of The Exorcist, when they wanted to make sure that Linda Blair's breath was super cold, they had to literally chill the room way, way down. So the actors walking around in dresses and suits are freezing to death in those sets. So the problem with that reveals evidence is that these fans are actually blowing the air at the actual actors that are pretending to be the astronauts. So every time that they jump up and down, I wouldn't say every single time in the shots that I've seen, but a lot of them, I think they adjusted for this, the dirt that comes up from their feet travels really far away really fast, as if there's an atmosphere on the moon and wind is blowing, which is obviously not the case. But we have this other problem, is that if you can see who these guys are inside the suits, then we have a problem. They're in low orbit, throwing around tuna cans and faking all the shots of the Earth, in opposite chronological order, of course. So you can't have the actors on the ground being identified. So the brilliant idea they came up with was to line the inside of the big glass faceplate that comes down. Any of you StarCraft fans will know exactly what I'm talking about. They lined it with gold, as I understand it, creating sort of a sunglasses effect. Their excuse for doing this was that it was going to be too bright to look down at the surface of the moon and survive. Now, we all know that skiing is something that has been done long before 1969, and we've all gone out with sunglasses on like the ones I'm wearing, and we're just fine. We're just fine, right? So this excuse is a bit of a stretch, but it 100% solves the problem for actors being on the soundstage. It blocks them out. Now, a few of the things that are interesting is that the doorways inside of the lunar module main environmental area where the two astronauts are, in this particular case with Apollo 11, you have Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong, they never filmed each other coming out of the door hole. You have Buzz going down a ladder. This is the famous shot with 5 light sources, which NVIDIA did a laughable job trying to debunk. I mean, it's amazing who's in on this thing, right? Those that try to debunk the Moon Hoax are in on it. It's just, especially at a corporate level, right? Individuals who watch YouTube and are simply butthurt about it, well, those are just free agents, right? And, some of this is going to be a repeat from the recent episodes, but this is all geared at the hoax, right? According to Bart Sibrel, with some of the original photographs from NASA from the 70s, you have 2 different colors of terrain soil. You have a brownish soil towards the bottom and a bluish soil towards the back props. Now, or maybe that's reversed, but it's one or the other. But it's all been color corrected nowadays with obviously modern software, and so the hoax has been concealed. But why were there 2 colors of soil? Well, part of it has to do with the fact that you have a physical floor that they're stepping on and doing all this fake 1/2 gravity, right? Which is, again, rolling the camera up 2x. These astronauts are still on supports. So every time they jump up and down, there's this cable above them that's insulating their fall back down to give them the sort of the motion of a less than 1/1 gravity look. And I forgot what mission it was, but one of the astronauts actually stumbled and fell down. And they have this little thing that they do, this little kick-up thing that they do, where they push on their hands and then they push on their feet and they push on their hands, and it gets them to be upright again. One of them had fallen down, and he was calling for help from his buddy. And his buddy is hopping across the set to help him out. And he reaches down with his hand to help him out. But before his hand ever touches the astronaut, whoever was handling his wire, the guy that had fallen down, he pulled too soon. And this astronaut pops right back up on his feet with physics incapability, right? There's no force that he has been able to derive from pushing off the soil to get upright again. So by the time guy touched him, he was already upright. Big mistake right there on our eyesight. But again, we want to believe this stuff, so we believe it, right? Now, a lot of people think that they saw it on TV, so when they saw it on TV, it was real. For Apollo 11, it was unbelievably pathetic the way that we got the initial footage of Neil Armstrong coming down that ladder. Of all the footage of all the missions to the moon, that footage, the most important footage in the world, was the lowest res footage that you ever saw of the mission as it was portrayed on the moon. Why was it low res? Well, one of the technical reasons why is that the networks were never allowed to have the original feed. The original feed would reveal where the original feed was coming from, which was Earth-to-Earth transmissions from the studio through a bunch of pipelines directly to the location where they were actually able to see it. The way that the footage was actually presented to you, technically speaking, was that the networks filmed a wall. NASA projected their feed from the studio onto a wall, and the networks were allowed to film the wall. Pretty unreal, right? But now, logistically speaking, Neil Armstrong had a Hasselblad on his chest, which is a big, gigantic, I think it's 110. It's like 100, it's a square, huge square negative. I probably have that wrong, but I grew up with these cameras, and the negative is almost 3 inches by 3 inches. So super high resolution, right? Now, we wanted to have done two different things. We want a live broadcast to this whole situation, which is going to have at least a 4-second delay, probably more like 10, 12-second delay by the time the signal gets to Earth and has to bounce through all the transmission mechanisms. But we also want to preserve this for time. This is, if we really do ever step on the moon, we want this in 4K, right? Now, obviously in 1969, we don't have such resolutions, but what we could have done is have a live camera feed, and we would have a small camera with a very tiny amount of film. At that time, it could have been a 16mm camera. That would have been enough to capture a super high res compared to what you saw footage. Now, the module itself has plenty of stuff on the outside of the system. Now, we all know that the radiation would have probably exposed all the film and all the scenarios had they really gone to the moon, just been holding a Hasselblad, right? The solar radiation would have gone through the Hasselblad in 2 seconds. And just like Madame Curie, who found out that uranium is radioactive by storing it bars on top of film in a closed cabinet drawer, and then developing the film and finding these big overexposed sections where the bar was, that's what would happen in space, most likely. So at the time, that the module's in low orbit, and the soundstage is acting out all these actors, you are having a script, again, that 2-column script for Buzz, for Michael, and for Neil to coordinate with what's going on in the studio. And it must have been a pain in the ass, but they probably rehearsed it quite a bit. But let me loop back for 1 second. The terrain in the background, the mountainsides and what have you, we think were simulated by a prop that was simply painted to look like the actual background. And so from certain perspectives, this is going to work perfectly. You're always controlling where the camera is in a studio to get the illusion that something's going back further than it was. So the color palette between the soil on the ground, which is probably made of something we can find, volcanic ash or something we pulverize here, and the paint that's on the back is why these photographs had 2 different colors of soil, easily modified in software today, right? But according to Bart Sibrel, they went out very cleanly inside of inside books back in the day. The other one I want to draw your attention to, which is utterly a smoking gun of all smoking guns, is the blue marble shot, I think taken from Apollo 17, and it is the clean shot of Earth from space. And unfortunately for NASA, there's 2 gigantic problems with this. One, Google Earth exists today, and the proportions of Africa in this shot are completely off, and Madagascar is way further north than it would be in reality. Now again, if you study the Peter projection map, then you're going to realize that all the shapes of the continents are wrong on all of our globes, and they've been wrong for over 70 years. Super sad on our part that we can't replace the globes with one that's actually accurate. But that's not the big smoking gun. The huge smoking gun is the Red Sea. I believe it's the Red Sea. It looks like a Great Lake. It's just kind of a little worm that goes left to right, east to west, And the problem for NASA is when they composited the shot, they have the Earth closing off the lake, opening back up, closing it off, opening back up, because it's a composite shot of high altitude planes, or maybe even low orbit photographs. But they made a huge mistake, and coincidentally, they fixed that since then. Again, a pure shot. If I just say, I'm going to walk up to you, I'm going to be 3 feet away with my Nikon zippity zap camera that's got a mega, gigapixel, whatever, and take a picture of your face. You're not going to be Picasso one day with 2 of your eyeballs on one side of your face, and then later on it just miraculously moves you to have both eyes on, opposite sides of your head. This is what NASA wants you to believe. Now let's start from scratch and review very quickly. The Saturn V launches. 3 astronauts go in low orbit. The set on Earth is timed perfectly with what they think this mission is going to would have been had it been real. The satellite that was inserted into space, I think in March of 1969, somewhere in that time frame, that simulated the entire mission for all the ground control people, has been either relaunched, or the data on the satellite has either a script 2, or they were able to upload a different script. Probably just had a script 2 in it. When the launch happens in July of 1969, that satellite is still going around the Earth and beaming down to all the listening stations, including NASA headquarters and the Russians and all this other stuff. Anyone who wanted to monitor this launch is actually getting information from a false satellite. Well, it's a real satellite, but it's not the anything to do with the capsules going to the moon. So at all the precise moments, they're saying, because you hear this a lot, the Russians watched us go to the moon. Well, they didn't watch us with telescopes and having the module go down to the moon and come back up. No one has that footage. That doesn't exist. What they were watching was the telemetry transmissions from these supposed spaceships back down to Earth, all being orchestrated by this satellite that was used to simulate the full mission 3 or 4 months before. Just prior to getting to the moon, quote unquote, in the script, the astronauts want to furnish footage of the Earth getting smaller, as if they are going away from the Earth, right? Well, the problem is, when Bart Sibrel did his movie, A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon, someone leaked, I think, a 56-minute movie to him. At least the full version I saw on YouTube a long time ago, which I can't find anymore, was about that length. They are using a window, a round window with a fisheye lens, piece of glass in it, that's obviously going to grab a tremendous amount of the spectrum. It's a wide-angle lens, basically, of the Earth. Now, Neil Armstrong says to NASA on recording, I've pushed the camera lens directly against the window, and everything that you see is Earth, and the black part around Earth is space. And again, can't see the Milky Way, can't see Sirius, which is complete bunk in itself, but let's just say you adjust your brain to believe that suspension of disbelief, right? The problem for them is that they've actually got a gel over the right side of the window simulating the sun, creating the sun's moving to the west, and they're simulating the sun going dark on the right side of the Earth. But they filmed this with atomic clock stamping in the camera in reverse chronological order. So they filmed the further away shots first, because it's easier to kind of get your ball bearings together, get the equipment set up. And then as they perfected the shot, they moved the camera closer and closer to this window, and the blackness that you see is actually the inside of the cabin. It's not the edge of the Earth. In this shot, you have arms that got in the way, that moved in front of the camera. Like right now, if a third person, if you're watching this on YouTube, put it this way, if a second person was with me and they put their hands in front of the lens, you would know that I'm not by myself in this backyard, which I am at this point. But you have shots with arms going between the camera and the window. You also have the red lights that are in the room got in the shot. At the very last shot, they turn the lights on in the cabin. You see someone pull the gel off the window, and Michael Collins turns the camera to his face and makes a goofy expression to basically signify, well, that's part of the hoax that we just finished. Awesome. To review, when they were supposed to be close to the Earth, they're filming the faraway shots. When they're far away from the Earth, they're filming the close shots, all in reverse order, thus exposing the hoax. And someone leaked this video, either by accident or on purpose. As Bart described it, he said that most people that were doing moon documentaries were sent giant canister stacks of all the footage from whatever mission they were interested in covering. And he said, of everyone I've ever talked to, they only used the first 2 or 3 cans of this footage. But he went all the way to the bottom and watched every single piece of footage. And again, all he ever asked for was Apollo 11, with the assumption that if they were going to make any mistakes, it obviously would have been on the first try. And he was right. Now, many of you have seen, I think it's 16, where someone actually walked onto the set during the filming and pulled an object off the ground and walked off the set. And in the original shot, you can see this human being. You got the astronaut over there by the Lunar Lander, and this guy walks onto the right side of your screen, takes something off, and walks off. Now, some people think, oh, that was faked later on, through After Effects or something, and this creates this fake disinformation. When someone rolled back the footage that NASA actually broadcast, what you see is the shadow of the person suddenly appear and suddenly go away. The person has been cropped out, but their shadow is still infinitesimally registering in the original footage. So we think that that's pretty evident that this is obviously a soundstage and someone accidentally walked in the shot during a broadcast live moment. So they're in low orbit. When someone who's watching the clock, based on the mission idea of the slingshot theory of getting to the moon, when it starts having to be the moon footage, the studio kicks on, the astronauts are given their cues, and it's got to be a pretty good rehearsal back and forth. Now, I wasn't alive when this was happening, so I have no idea whether or not footage from the moon, other than Neil Armstrong jumping down the ladder with this horrible grainy footage, okay, trying to hide the mistakes is basically what they're trying to do. With super low grain footage, broadcasting it on a wall, projecting it on a wall, making the networks take it off the wall. Atrocious, right? Let's put it this way. There's more logistics in broadcasting that on the wall and hiding its original signal than just giving the networks the original signal source. What's interesting to me is that I can't imagine that source being able to be encrypted in any way, shape, or form. Maybe they could. I don't know. They mess with the scan line length, so a normal television can't process it. I don't know. I mentioned this in episode 26. I'll just mention it briefly here. The Hasselblad camera that Neil Armstrong had to his chest is a camera that is a square box, and you have to look down inside the viewfinder to see if you got the right shot. Now, the amount of time-life cover shots that Neil Armstrong was able to take in a camera that held probably about 30 frames per roll of film, and I was not aware that they ever reloaded the camera, because that is not an easy step. I guarantee you, he would have to be inside the environmental capsule with that camera to at all get it off of his chest so he could see what he was doing. In order to reload a Hasselblad back, you have to put this silver door into the back of the actual film canister, and then you can disconnect it and it's protected the film. You can put that down, grab another one, put it on, pull the sliver out, then you'd have to reattach it to your chest, right? Now, how many of you have shot selfies over and over and over again just to get that perfect angle of your face and your friends or whatever? How many of you just taken a ton of pictures with your camera at Disneyland or the beach or wherever, the Eiffel Tower, and you're trying to get the right shot? Now imagine I give you the best camera in the world. In fact, I give you a Hasselblad and I wire it to your chest. And I say, you're at Disneyland. Easy, tons of stuff to take pictures of. And I want you to bring me back the amount of shots that Neil Armstrong got perfectly composed in his camera without being able to look down. The excuse is that he was highly trained. Okay, yeah, right. You've never been here before. You've never done this before. You have no idea what you're up against. You're standing on a crater, you're up and down, whatever. You're not going to get everything cropped perfectly. As well, the gentleman who built the Hasselblad for the moon missions was interviewed on a face-to-face interview. I can't find this anymore, but they asked him what would happen if this camera heated up to 250 degrees Fahrenheit, which they actually claim is about 280, I think, and then went down to 280 below zero, and then back up. The guy said, well, the camera would explode. They can't handle that. That means that they couldn't have pulled this off. Because according to NASA, and this is the problem with the SpaceX rover in space thing, or their Tesla in space, you can't have metals with this gigantic discrepancy in heat and cold. it twists and expands in the opposite directions, and so you're going to have actually an object explode. At least distort so much that the shutter isn't going to work inside, and nothing's going to, maybe even the Zeiss lens cracks, you know. How many of you have had a windshield crack when it's really hot out and then you accidentally wash your car and it goes split, right? My neighbor had his passenger side window explode on his truck across the street when it got really hot here the other day. They thought someone actually abused his truck, but they kind of figured out, well, it's probably just got fractured somewhere in the construction that he does. And then when the hot and cold happened, it just took it all the way. But now think about the claim that a bunch of people have to be in on this conspiracy. We're going to get back to the mission in a second, but it doesn't take much, does it? I mean, it takes probably a few hundred people to run the sound stage, to get it all worked out. It takes a lot of people to communicate secretly with the capsule in low orbit, which we have evidence by a third voice that tells the astronaut when to talk. It totally told Neil Armstrong to talk.
Okay, Roger,
Because they're trying to, when they communicate with the astronauts, they're trying to simulate the time delay of 2 seconds up and 2 seconds back. Most of the communications are way under 4 seconds, which means this couldn't be real. When Nixon calls the astronaut from the White House, I think he talked to Neil Armstrong. He said, you know, you guys are doing great. Those second delays are like half a second, a second. It's way too quick to have this conversation, the fluidity that they did. Another sign that it's all on Earth and it's a big hoax. So when it comes time to land, this is one of the things that blows my mind about people. They'll say something like, well, how did they splash down in the ocean if they didn't really go to the moon? And you're like, what does the moon have to do with splashing down in the ocean? Now, before we get to the actual splash, this lunar module, this, again, cone-shaped craft that they all come back in, all right, is said to turn around, so there's a blast shield on the bottom, like a shield that's designed to take amazing temperatures as they're coming in at this very perfect angle, because if they get too shallow, they're going to bounce off. They come in too steep, they're going to vaporize. It's the ship rubbing against the atmosphere. It's pretty brilliant that they figured that out. When they got into high-speed aircraft, they figured this out very quickly. Was that the SR-71 is said to be so hot, its windshields are so hot you could take an egg, throw it against the windshield, and it will cook before it falls back down in your lap. Pretty interesting. By 1969, as I understand it, the SR-71 was well in use, so they had this knowledge, right? But if they're truly in low orbit, which I think they were, as evidence of their video of the Earth through this portal window, of course they got to come down. Now, a physicist did a simulation of this shape, of this bullet shape, hitting the atmosphere, and could not, in any circumstance, throw it at the atmosphere in a way that it didn't turn so the point was down. So that's a bit of a mystery as to whether or not these astronauts came down in an upside-down configuration or a bottom configuration. Maybe there's a way to get it to happen with the bottom configuration. But they splashed down in the ocean from a low orbit. And for some people, that was the complete validation of all this other hocus pocus, these bad photography, all the evidence on the moon that it was an absolute hoax. The perfect shots, this ridiculous contraption called the Lunar Lander. If you ever just pull up the shot of the Lunar Lander and disconnect your mind for a split second from what you're seeing as being real, you'll start to look at this thing and go, really? That's the best they could do in terms of coming up with a ship that looks like it could land on the moon and then take back off again, right? Because the top part has like some sort of explosive with this little, I don't know, I always heard it was an explosive that just blasted it back up into space, right? This is a maneuver that is probably the most volatile, dangerous thing of the entire mission, is to get back up into moon orbit and then rendezvous with the module and get back home. Worked the first time, every time, and no one's ever been able to do it since. Again, no other nation on Earth has been able to go to the moon with computer power 1,000,000 times more intense than what they had on those ships. Our rocketry is now profoundly more powerful than the Saturn V. and no one can do it. Now let's go on to Apollo 12, because there's a little bit of evidence with that one too, of the soundstage. Now everything else is pretty much in the bag. Launching the Saturn V, doing the low orbit shots, and landing back and splashing, that's locked in. No problem there. I mean, obviously it's a super complicated thing, and hats off to everyone who participated in that. They're all geniuses, and without them, this thing we never would have any accomplishments in space. So I have big respect for everyone involved with this thing, up to the point of killing Gus Grissom and his buddies. But they needed to improve on the mission to make it more exciting. Why would anyone continue watching missions on the moon? Well, according to all of my friends who watched it back in the day on TV, they said that it was super duper stressed in Apollo 11, that these boosters were completely, they were at the bare minimum of thrust. The F1 boosters were the bare minimum of thrust to get this thing into space and make this entire mission possible. They even said, as I've heard it communicated to me from first-hand people that saw it, that you couldn't bring a paperclip. Now, this is an exaggeration most likely, but they couldn't bring 10 pounds more on this Saturn V and have the mission be successful, because it wouldn't have enough thrust to make all these elliptical slingshot orbit theories work, which I'm not completely convinced that actually works at all, but whatever. So what do they bring up in Apollo 12? They bring up what I like to call, and my co-host from MK Ultra Radio, Kyle, said, the Chrysler. They bring up a Jeep. It's based on the Jeep, the military Jeep that you would see in like the sitcom MASH, those old Jeeps from World War II. They strip one completely down. They realized inflated tires aren't going to work. Again, ingenious ideas. They come up with this sort of corrugated steel tire. It's just unbelievably brilliant. It's mostly hollow, right? But you have this, I think it's about 700 pounds, 699 pounds or so, that goes up on this rocket. Well, they didn't adjust the F1 boosters one iota between the first mission and the last mission. So how were they able to put this in orbit? According to them, it was impossible. Again, according to them, it's impossible to do. But we're just like, whatever, man, take up a spaceship, whatever, right? Well, the very first shots we ever see of this moon rover lacks any tire marks. They filmed the front left quarter panel of this vehicle, and there's no tracks. They also don't have any footage of actually unloading this thing and putting it together, the whole thing is supposedly folded out, right? Brilliant idea. And then there's something else you start to notice when you look at all the rover footage, and I mean all of it. It looks like the astronaut outfit that's inside this thing is a dummy. I mean, it looks like a human, but it doesn't move. As this thing is bouncing around and throwing up the big rooster tail, again, it's all off of, it's all inaccurate to 1/6 gravity, but so you buy that double X thing. Again, if you take all the moon footage and you double the play speed to 2x, which every player in the world can do, right? Just download some footage and play at 2x, you're going to see real time. That's not 1/6 gravity, okay? It's just not. But you don't see anybody on this car. I mean, if you see this footage, please send it to me, because I watched probably, 10 minutes of this stuff, and I never saw an astronaut wave. Hey, how's it going, man? Or take the wheel and really strong arm it here and there. There's, I think both arms are on it, or one arm's off, or something like this. But the person in this vehicle doesn't move like a normal human being. Turn in the head like this. Hey, what's going on, right? I mean, I know you got a little bit of restraint from the suit, but it looks like they ran like some remote control vehicle. It might have been that when they put a person inside the suit and put them on this Jeep and then put them on the set, that it gets stuck like a dune buggy on the beach, which I see it all the time, right? People drive these little ATVs or whatever they are, all-terrain vehicles on the beach, and for the most part they're okay, but if they get in the loose dry sand and sit there for a while and crank the tires a couple times, they're stuck. They need people to help them get out. Now, I'm trying to keep this out of the how we know all this, like all the evidence that this was fake, because you can watch my other episodes where I go through that ad nauseum. But because they made the mistakes in Apollo 11, they repeated the mistakes in all the other episodes, all the other missions, right? Which are episodes on TV filmed in a soundstage. The lack of any soil on the feet of the Lunar lander. They kept that mistake going the entire time. They never even attempted to move soil underneath. There's at least 2 missions that use the same exact set, meaning the mountains in the background, which are paintings or maybe rear projection, are the same. And all they did was they rustled up some rocks on the ground. One of the interesting things that that no one really talks about is that the first 3 astronauts came back, Buzz, Michael, and Neil, and in their press conference with the world, they looked like they'd been crying. And you know what that looks like, that red face. They look like they've been crying, which, I mean, all three of them look super depressed. There wasn't one of them that was like giddy and the other 2 were depressed. All 3 of them were absolutely just, I don't know, dead. But the additional groups of 3 that they put up there were totally and completely into this. And they had no problem taking the interviews and talking about it at length. It's very interesting. Now, what do they do to make us believe today that it was real? Well, aside from faking more and more evidence, fake shots of the lunar landers on the moon, which are 4 times as large as they would normally be on the moon, you have to understand that when we take a picture of a foreign planet with a surveillance satellite, again, this is probably all fake, but they tell us that a pixel equals a certain amount of cubic space on the surface of wherever they're taking these pictures. And so when we take the ratio of the pixel, so let's say 1 pixel was a yard, 3 feet square, and we look at the lunar module pictures that they brought back, and we study the 4 feet that are on the lunar module, it's 4 times as big as it should be. Well, it didn't just grow, okay? Another painful piece of evidence. But the interesting one that I hear a lot about, and I haven't got a barrage from you guys in a while, it's usually only the newcomers that do this. I mentioned this in previous episodes, but some of the astronauts have been told or elected to keep this facade going by talking about aliens. They say, this is one of the defensive theories, that we did go to the moon, but when we got there, we found a bunch of alien stuff. Alien, like, huge sculptures and cities, and on the black side of the moon, the dark side of the moon, that there's all kinds of alien bases and all this other stuff. John Lear's all into this kind of thing, right? Your problem with the logistics of this is the following. 1, we have telescopes that are massively powerful in the amateur astronomy world. If there was any logical movement on the surface of the bright side, which is where we landed in the Sea of Tranquility and all these other locations, we'd be able to see a craft moving across the surface of the moon. Now, there have been videos submitted on YouTube, loosely sourced, that claim to have this kind of stuff. I'm not convinced any of that's not just someone having fun with footage. If you have one that you think is very believable, please link it down below on YouTube and I'll take a look. But the chronology of the problem of creating the hoax to protect the alien encounter is the following. If this was all real, and there would be no soundstage anywhere. There wouldn't be any soundstage anywhere in the world because they really are there and they're really taking all these shots. The idea that overnight, Neil Armstrong comes down the ladder and he turns around and there's freaking Klaatu looking at him or these gray aliens looking at him. There's not enough time to fake all that stuff I told you about, such that the population doesn't have we'll get you the moon footage in a month or 6 months, all right? All of it happened chronologically just as we thought it was real, as it was portrayed to us. So there's no time to fake all this stuff. Yeah, sure, the additional missions you can make up any story you want. But one of the things they want you to do is to say, well, we know there's aliens on the moon, or I've heard a really credible story by some of the astronauts, that went there supposedly, right? They're peddling this stuff. I forgot what astronaut lives in Malibu, but he's the guy that shows up to UFO groups and lies out his teeth about all the crap that he saw. Because if you can just automatically assume that aliens exist on the moon, then that validates the moon missions. Well, of course we went to the moon. Well, how do you know that? Well, we saw aliens. That part is true. Oh, okay, well then everything about getting to the moon is true then. It's a backhanded way of making a lie a truth. I'm going to suggest you don't fall for it, okay? Now, I have a whole episode about the moon and its mystery of why it's there, why it's so huge, and there are a lot of anomalies with it. For those that are flat earthers, which some of you just rolled your eyes, there is a mysterious thing that, the moon perfectly eclipses the sun. And I mean perfectly. And again, what are the frickin' odds that we've got this 1,200 mile diameter ball surrounding our 8,000 mile diameter Earth? It's too big for us. The sun is 93 million miles away, supposedly, and it all just aligns perfectly so that this eclipse happens. There's probably nothing more suspicious than the fact that those two objects in space are the same exact size. In my moon episode, I talk about the theory that the moon is actually a burned out sun. I heard this somewhere, and I thought it was utterly fascinating. It was like, yeah. So if you're going to replace the sun, if these are light bulbs that just basically burn out, then you would replace it with one exactly the same size, because that's the one that provides the ecosystem for this planet that's down here. Or, if it's a flat Earth disk, it's just up there rotating somehow, right? I do think it's interesting, and I'm just going to end this on a bumper. For those of you who hate flat Earth, you can just click off the video right now, but I'll just tell you, coming in as a super science kid, having been super privileged to meet utterly brilliant people at NASA that have done other things that have nothing to do with the moon missions, it fascinates me that someone can be so cavalier about the flat Earth thing being wrong. I think at best, if you are a discerning scientist, okay, you're going to be left with a paradox. If you really just subtract out of your brain everything you've been told is true, you look at the Peter projection map and you realize that our continents on all of our globes are wrong, and that there was a movement in the early 50s to get all of our globes updated. I mean, we made them a long time ago, and so of course we didn't have space travel, we didn't have high altitude planes and all this other stuff to look down and go, oh, this shit's actually a different shape. Here's your problem if you want to be so certain about where you are. All the pictures of Earth from space are fake. Every single one of them. There are videos out there where they interviewed the latest guy in the last 10 years, from 2018 back to 2008, this young kid who does the composite work of the shots of the Earth using high altitude pictures, either from satellites or from planes or whatever. And he says on this tape, well, it's a composite. It has to be. It's a composite. It has to be. It's interesting that the person gifted with this job has no other scenario in his mind to take a picture of the Earth from space, but a geocentric orbit satellite should be able to be a live feed of Earth. And they've attempted these live feeds where they say, oh, here's an animation of 24 hours of the Earth rotating, and we find out that storm systems have literally been cut and pasted over and over and over in the same shot, so the same unique snowflake of a cloud is repeated a bunch of times, pretty far away from each other, so it wouldn't be any sort of pattern that would be a natural phenomenon. And unless any of you have been an astronaut, you've never had the opportunity to fly up there and see it for yourself. So how can you be so certain? Where do we have the footage of a plane flying over the Antarctica with continuous shot? Just fly over it, man. Just put a camera out there with some ungodly 512 gigabyte RAM stick and just let it film out the door. Hell, go with a 1980s camcorder that can film for 8 hours in low definition. We don't have that footage, right? But now a lot of the evidence that has been suggested to prove it's flat has also not been proven. The gyroscope and a plane, no footage of that, just a claim of that, over and over and over and over again. So you get some disinfo, and you get some sort of official science info. Now, we do look out into space and we see the moon. It's a round object. We see the sun. It's a round object. We have colleges that film these things with kids that watch it all day. They watch the sun rotate, right? And it rotates, and you can see it's a big ball in space. We can see a lot of our neighboring planets pretty good in a telescope, and they're round objects. They seem to have gaseous sort of surfaces with at least Saturn and Jupiter, right? But the real thing I want to bumper into this thing with is this. The space agencies of this world today are in the picture business and the movie business. They are only selling you, once the rocket is out of sight and out of mind, right? Once it's launched and lost all of its vertical lift, right? You can just see it falling around maybe the side of the Earth. I don't know, maybe crashing into the sea. I don't know. As soon as it's out of sight, out of mind, with especially this little blackout period that they say they have to have, which seems ridiculous, but whatever, we'll go with that little thing being a necessity. I think it was a chance for them to change the feeds from, resetting the script. Well, we're going to tell everybody that we can't communicate for X number of seconds, minutes, or whatever, and then we're really just changing to the ground feed, or we're syncing the two feeds together, or whatever they're doing. But after that point, all you get is pictures for your $60 million a day. The Voyager Satellites. Again, like I've said, Hollywood had perfected by 1984, I said 2004, I think in my episode, unfortunately, they were able to simulate in a computer spherical projections of whatever surface that they think that object might have, whether it be Mars or Jupiter or Saturn. They were able to do the rings, that's no problem. It's really just a flat plane that's invisible, and you project the spherical drawing on there, which the rings are situated. But the other thing that struck me the other day, especially about the Voyager, which I think launched in 1976, the first one, hey, we have amazing artists in this world who could take a sphere built out of whatever's the most perfectly round thing. It could be steel, could be wood, could be anything, and they could paint that thing to look exactly like whatever we think these bodies might look like closer up. Right? Now, I think because Saturn having the hexagon or the pentagon or whatever it is across the top, I think it's a hexagon, it's a spherical calculation that's deteriorating as the orbit of the algorithm actually starts to condense on itself. Again, I've said this recently, I'll say it again because we're on this episode. When I used to use paint applications back in the 80s and all the way in the 90s, of course, obviously till today, drawing a circle on paint applications was fairly decent when you would drag the circle very large, but when you drew them smaller and smaller, there was no anti-aliasing back in the day, so it wasn't smoothed out through differential grays in this thing. It was a binary thing. It was either black or white pixel. As soon as you drew it smaller, these things could not remain circular, and it was a big problem in Photoshop all the way up until probably the 21st century, where what I had to do was draw a bunch of little circles or draw big ones and try to shrink them down. Maybe the algorithm for scaling was a little bit better, but it was a problem. Everything was pretty whacked out, and I can imagine when they were inventing these algorithms, it didn't work out well, but it was still amazingly convincing, right? So where could they be lying today? Everywhere. Rovers on Mars, more missions to the moon, which are just orbital. All these different things trying to orbit moons from Saturn or Jupiter. They could all be fake. But they seem to only greenlight missions that are fairly simple for them to use their existing platforms to fake, right? But the 2 points I'm trying to prove in this episode is that, one, not a lot of people had to be involved in terms of, let's say, for instance, 10,000 people participated in the creation of the Apollo project that went to the moon. The CERN Hadron Collider supposedly has 10,000 people as well. Well, think of the Hadron Collider. A bunch of people build it, and they generally know what the scientists meant by building these collider, these wafers that check all this scattering proton matter. But in terms of the actual sensor data going through a bunch of software and outputting on a monitor as to what you think you actually found, well, there's a lot of places in between the pipeline of the collider and the actual output data that could be hijacked, right? They could hijack that data and say, well, we want to see is this. So we're going to make this little interrupting piece of software that goes, this is what you saw. The real data is being pulled off to a separate location and looked at perhaps for a different objective. Who knows, right? But all we need is a bunch of people, probably, I would say 50 to 100 maybe, to participate in the creation of this soundstage. That's where most of the hoax becomes absolutely laughable. In terms of the low orbit, well, that's a real mission. That's a low orbit mission. In terms of what they're doing in the capsule, you only see the capsule if it has a transmission coming from it, right? If the transmission is encrypted, going down to special sources on Earth that are, again, bases that we don't actually have access to because they're military bases, then the astronauts are simply beaming down to these stations that are not in the public domain. So we can get Neil Armstrong's voice to coincide with the script. The fascinating thing is that all three men sat together during the entire mission to the moon, every single time. But they had to simulate that 2 of them are down on the moon and 1 of them still in the orbital capsule around the moon, right? Remember, 1 of them never goes down. So Michael Collins never touched the moon. That's kind of a bummer, right? What I don't know why is that I think Michael Collins didn't take an interview at all. And when Bart Sibrel tried to approach him at a supermarket, he absolutely would not talk about anything, which is, again, I think it was 40 years after the moon mission, and he would talk about it. I mean, it was 32 years after he did that mission, he wouldn't talk about it. Or probably a couple more years after that, because the other movie, Astronauts Gone Wild, took a couple of years to make after that first one. But anyway, he wouldn't talk about it. Why wouldn't you talk about something you did that was amazing? Why not? Why not level that guy? If he's out there peddling lies about your missions, why not sit there and just Occam's razor the guy down, right? Instead, all the Occam's razors turn out to be, well, if this stuff is improbable or impossible, you must subtract those things. Whatever you have left is what the mission actually was, which is not there. NASA has lost all the original footage. NASA has lost all the original schematics, right? The F1 boosters have never been revealed to the public. The rocks that were donated to, the Russian ambassador in England turned out to be petrified wood. Fake, fake, fake. There must be something about the original video that they got from the moon that if the physical film was studied, it would be very evident it never went to space. And again, for those of you who are pilots, remember, you have to wear a little radiation badge on your lapel so that you can study how much radiation you've been exposed to as a pilot. And after 20,000 hours in in just commercial airlines or flying fighter jets or whatever, you're pulled out of commission because you've received the maximum amount of radiation your body is supposed to ever receive. What would an astronaut feel in a 1/4 inch aluminum capsule going through the Van Allen belts? Something that nearly killed all the astronauts in 1998 in the space shuttle. But you're going to spend days inside this thing because you're doing this big loop-de-loop thing through the Van Allen belts, right? And you're going to head off to the moon, which has no protection whatsoever. And you're in this hot, and you're in this cold, and you're in hot and this cold. You're going to die. You're going to die super duper fast, way before you ever get to the moon. And again, it's the only accomplishment of man that has never been repeated by any other nation. That should give you a pretty good indication of the fact that it's a hoax. So anyway, I hope this episode was useful. You can now answer the question of how they did it. You can also rebut the fact that a bunch of people had to conspire to make this thing happen. Yeah, it's more than perhaps a small group of people, but it's not a massive group of people, and by no means the overwhelming majority of people. Again, remember, probably 97 to 99% of everyone who participated in these missions could be interviewed and they would pass the polygraph test because to them, they saw the evidence that they needed to see in order to prove to them that these missions actually occurred. But none of them actually saw it. Those of you who are so certain the world is a heliocentric ball, it's only through logic presented to you by the science community with a capital S, the new religion, that makes you feel like you're on a ball. Explain to me how the moon perfectly eclipses the sun. Okay, just do that for me. If you haven't been to deepthoughtsradio.com, please go. There's audio, video, a locked Facebook group, and a Patreon page. For those of you who support me in any way, shape, or form, thank you very much. Your comments have been amazing. Show's off to a good start. And I will see you in the next episode. So take care of yourself and someone else. Over now.